Okay, so we left off with talking about the types of connective tissues. So we'll finish off connective tissues here. And so we left off with bone. And bone is also called osseous tissue, as probably many of you know. And bone, some of the main functions of bone, again, easy, intuitive to remember, that it's there for support, right? That's what our skeleton is for. It provides support. And it also protects lots of body structures. So for example, again, our ribs help to protect our lungs, right? And our heart, like our sternum helps, so our sternum and our ribs help to protect the heart. So obviously protection of body structures is another important portion of function for bone. Also, kind of another one that you might not think of is the fact that because bone has inorganic calcium salts inside it, it also ends up being kind of a function of mineral storage. So if you want to kind of add that off to the side here, it also functions as mineral storage. And so those are kind of the main functions of bone. Also, some, again, other known functions of bone that you might not think of right away are the fact that it stores fat. So it actually stores fat in the yellow marrow inside your bone, which we'll get to more in a chapter on bones. And then it also synthesizes, synthesizes blood cells, again, in the red marrow inside your spongy bone, which we'll talk about when we get to the actual chapter on bone. So again, just kind of prepping you for some of those other functions of bone that might not be quite as obvious, but it's very important, again, for synthesizing all of our blood cells because of that red marrow. It has more collagen than compared to cartilage, which, again, is going to make it a tougher structure with more tensile strength. And then, again, it has these organic calcium salts, so it ends up being this like calcium store. It's kind of calcium sink for us. And as we'll talk about, that is very important because when we get to muscle contraction, calcium and our blood calcium levels are actually very important for muscle contraction. So it's important that bone is this like calcium sink for us as well. Our osteoblasts, as remember we talked about the blast cells, our osteoblasts are going to be producing the matrix. And then once again, our osteoblasts mature and then trap themselves in that lacuna, then now they just maintain the matrix as a mature bone cell, basically. And so again, they're going to be in the matrix inside these little cavities that we call lacuna, or lacunae is the plural. And so very important that you know, again, for this chapter and then for the bone chapter, that the individual structural unit of compact bone, and we're going to mainly talk about compact bone. Spongy bone is also, again, a bone connective tissue, but we're going to focus on compact bone here, and we'll talk more about spongy bone when we get to the chapter on bones. But osteons are the individual structural unit for bone, okay? So important to know that if you have a question, what's the structural unit for bone? It's an osteon, okay? And that always seems to be, as a hint, that always seems to be a question that students miss on the practicals, almost always, okay? So I'm going to try to clear that up for you in this next slide where I actually have some images to show you what an osteon is. And then bone is very richly vascularized, meaning it has lots of, again, lots of blood innervation, blood vessel innervation. So again, we see here that this is your bone tissue. Again, the matrix is going to be this kind of hard, calcified matrix that contains lots of collagen fibers, makes it really tough. And then our osteocytes, well, before I get to our osteocytes, let me talk about what an osteon is. So here is this osteon right here, okay? And that's our structural functional unit for bone, okay? So here's an osteon. Here's another osteon. Here's another osteon over here. And so what an osteon looks like is it looks like you've taken a tree and like sliced through the, the stem of the tree. So you can see that here. And you'll see that it looks like it has these like annual rings to them. So here is like one of these annual rings right here, and here's one of these annual rings. Those annual rings, just for lab purposes, are what we call lamella. Okay, so here's this, oops, and you can see that here as well. You can see these rings. So kind of like the tree, if you can think of lamella as your tree rings, okay? And that's exactly what they look like. So each osteon is going to have these lamella, these rings, and basically lamella are rings of matrix, okay? So all of these rings of matrix in each osteon are going to surround what's called the central haversian canal. And that central haversian canal is going to carry your blood vessels, it's going to carry your lymph vessels, it's going to carry your nerves, okay, to each osteon unit. Now, your osteocytes are going to kind of be pushed up in the periphery of each ring of matrix here, the lamella, right? And so the osteocytes, remember, are going to be found inside these spaces that we call the lacuna, because basically the osteocyte kind of traps itself just like this. Here's your osteocyte, and it traps itself in this little space, right? And now it's surrounded by that calcified matrix. And that space is called the lacuna. There's your osteocyte. And then for the osteocytes to actually get nutrients and, and get nutrients and then get rid of waste through that central canal, we need to be able to have some connection to it. And so we do that through, or bone cells do this through, what are called canaliculi. And these canaliculi are going to be these little tunnels. And osteocytes are actually not these like perfect round cells. They actually have these nice little extensions coming off of those. And those extensions will actually run through these canaliculi and connect to one osteocyte to the next, and then eventually to that haversian canal where the blood supply is. So what ends up happening is nutrients can get passed from here, the haversian canal, through these canaliculi to this osteocyte, and then through these canaliculi to this osteocyte, and then through these canaliculi to this osteocyte, way out here. So those canaliculi are very, very important. Again, this is the way that it transports nutrients and also gets rid of waste, okay? So just to help you out with lab again, here is an osteon. Here's the haversian or central canal. And then here are the lamellae. And then these are the osteocytes. These little black parts are the osteocytes that are inside the lacuna. And then they're connected via these little black stringy things that we call the canaliculi. Okay, so hopefully that really helps you clear up things a little bit for lab. And I love this diagram here because it really kind of gives you that nice, good image of what it looks like. So, and of course, again, we talked about the function of bone. Again, acting as support, protection, calcium stores, really important, and some other minerals. Also stores for fat in the marrow, and it's the site of blood cell formation. And so again, this is just all the things I just talked about, but put in words for you. And I also really like this diagram too, because it shows you, we also will talk about these little canals here called the Volkmann canals that'll connect haversian canal from one osteon to another osteon. But again, a little more than, we're going to get into that in bone, so don't worry about Volkmann's just yet. Okay, our next connective tissue is an actual liquid connective tissue. And so it's hard to remember that this one's connective tissue, but just remember that, again, we have a bunch of cells inside a matrix. It's just this time, that matrix is a fluid matrix. It's a liquid matrix that we call plasma, okay? And our cells for blood as a connective tissue are either going to be our red blood cells, which in anatomy and physiology, we're going to more formally call erythrocytes. Erythro means red, cyte means cell, so literally the red cells, red blood cells. And then we also have your leukocytes. Leuko means white, again, cyte means cell. So our leukocytes are our white blood cells. And The function, of course, of our blood is going to be to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide, transport gases, and our red blood cells are going to be doing that, right? Also transport nutrients, okay, throughout the body and waste. Our red blood cells are going to be doing that. And then, of course, it has this immune function, right, as well for again, some protection against, again, invaders, right? And so that's going to be our leukocytes, our white blood cells are going to be responsible for that. And then they don't mention it here, but I'm just going to really briefly mention it because, again, you're going to go into this in 202 because you have a whole chapter on blood. But you also have these things called platelets. They're not shown here, but these little fragments, we call them platelets, or in 202 we call them thrombocytes. And their main function is going to be to stop bleeding. So, and they look like these little cell fragments. They're not even like a whole cell. So again, that gives you kind of the real quick, brief rundown of blood. We're not going to go into it too much just because, again, remember, you're going to have this all in 202. Same here with our next, so we're done with connective tissue, right? A lot of connective tissue, whoa. So again, if you have questions on connective tissue, please come see me. I'm happy to help you out with that. So please come see me. Our next type of tissue is going to be muscle tissue. Again, we're just going to go through this really briefly because in just like a couple chapters, we're going to have a whole chapter on this, okay? So very briefly, muscle tissue is highly vascularized. You intuitively know this because you know that your meat, which is mostly muscle, right, that you're eating is red. It's red for a reason. That's because it's got a lot of blood vessels running through it. It's responsible for most types of movement. So it's what's moving your bones, right? So our muscle, that's its main function, is for movement. Muscle cells do possess these things called myofilaments that are going to be made up of actin and myosin proteins. We talked about those actin and myosin proteins that are going to be responsible for contraction. Again, we'll get into those myofilaments much more detail when we get to the muscle chapter. Really briefly, I'm going to go through the three types of muscle tissue: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. Again, mostly for the purposes of lab to help you identify them. So skeletal muscle is going to be for our voluntary movement, right? This is what you think of when you think of your muscles moving your body. This is your skeletal muscle attaching again from one bone to the other to move some part of the body. And these cells are going to be these really long cells. They're going to be striated, okay? And they're going to be multinucleate. So this right here is all one muscle cell, or in the muscle chapter, we'll call them muscle fibers, but all one muscle cell right here, this whole thing. And then it has many nuclei. So we call that multinucleate, many nuclei. And then obviously it has lots of striations, okay? So again, primarily for voluntary movement, locomotion, again, facial expressions, and that kind of thing. And it's under voluntary control. Okay, so this is the one muscle type that's going to be under voluntary control. And so that's all we're going to say about skeletal muscle, because again, we'll talk a lot more about skeletal muscle coming up. Second type of muscle tissue is cardiac muscle. And so here you can see in cardiac muscle, it looks a little bit like skeletal muscle in that it has striations, okay? But the difference here is the cells are a little bit smaller. They're more branched. You'll see more branching in these cells. And they only have one nuclei. So generally they're uninucleate, one nuclei. But the really easy way to identify cardiac muscle is to look for these guys, intercalated discs. Okay, and those intercalated discs are going to contain desmosomes. Okay, so remember those junctions, desmosomes, that are really going to help hold those cells together, and they have the kind of guy wires inside to help resist tearing when those cells contract. And then they also are going to have gap junctions. So gap junctions are going to be those kind of little channels that are going to go from one cell to the next, and that is going to allow cardiac muscle cells all to contract together. So those intercalated discs are very important, and they're the easiest way to identify cardiac muscle tissue from other muscle tissue. Look for those intercalated discs, okay? And so again, this cardiac muscle cell is going to be obviously under involuntary control. You don't have to, thank goodness, right? Constantly think about heartbeat, 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 because that would be bad. I mean, I would probably get too busy and forget. So again, really good that it's under involuntary control, right? Okay. And then we have smooth muscle cells. Smooth muscle cells, again, are going to be these nice spindle-shaped cells. They're going to have these nice big nuclei, kind of elongated central nuclei. There's no real true striations for this muscle tissue. And they kind of arrange themselves in these close sheets like this, okay? And so smooth muscle cells are also under involuntary control. And that's going to be really good because we're going to find smooth muscle cells mostly in the walls or lining the walls of these hollow organs like blood vessels, like our GI tract, like our bladder, okay? And so that's really good because the fact that it's involuntary is good because, again, we don't have to think about, okay, we need to contract, our esophagus to be able to push that food down to the stomach. And okay, stomach, you got to contract and churn and mix up that food. So thank goodness, again, that smooth muscle is under involuntary control and we don't have to think about that. It just does it for us, okay? So we'll also find it in places like the bladder as well. So that's your smooth muscle. Our next type of tissue, again, we're just going to briefly go over it because at the very end of the semester, we have a whole chapter on it, is going to be nervous tissue. And so nervous tissue obviously is going to be found in places like the brain, spinal cord, and our peripheral nerves. And this is going to regulate and control our body functions, okay? So it's made up of two specialized cells. We have our actual neurons, okay, that are actually transmitting messages. These are our specialized cells, okay, and their main job is just to conduct nervous impulses. And they are so, so important. Their job is so important that they have all these support cells that kind of feed them and protect them and take care of them, insulate them. And those are neuroglia cells, okay? And again, we'll talk about them much more. I'm just introducing them here, but we'll talk about them in much more depth when we get to the chapter on nervous tissue, okay? So I just wanted to introduce, because you'll see them in the slides, the neuroglia cells. So here you can actually see, here's your neurons right here, okay? So this is the cell body of your neurons. And then you'll see they'll have all these little extensions coming off of them. So the extensions that are going to receive messages are going to be your dendrites. And then the extensions that are going to process, as we should call them, the neuron processes that are going to transmit messages are our axons, okay, just to kind of give you as a heads up. But in your slides, you really can't tell what's the dendrites and what's the axons. It's very hard. So you usually, again, you just kind of know them as neuron processes. And then you usually can see the cell body of the neuron quite well, okay? And then, usually in your slides, you're going to see the nuclei of all of your neuroglial cells, all of these support cells. So all of these dark dots here are the nuclei of your supporting neuroglial cells, okay? So that's pretty much, I think, all you need to know about nervous tissue for now, at least enough to just kind of get you through the slides for your lab. And then we need to talk about membranes, okay? So now we've talked about the four major types of tissue, right? So now we're just going to talk about membranes here. We're going to slide it in here because membranes are going to consist of at least two primary tissue types, okay? So whether it be epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, nervous tissue, okay? But the majority of them are going to consist of epithelium bound to some underlying connective tissue proper, okay? So for the sakes of this class, okay, membranes are going to be, again, two major tissue types, epithelium tissue bound to connective tissue proper, okay? And I put 3-ish types because the Merriam text only talks about 3. Cutaneous membranes, which are basically going to be your skin, your mucous membranes, right, which are going to line things like your respiratory tract and your digestive tract and secrete mucus. And then we have our serous membranes that we talked about that are lining, again, organs that are contracting to help kind of reduce friction. So things like the peritoneum around your abdominal organs and your pleura around your lungs and your pericardium around your heart, okay? So we'll talk about those in just a minute. And then for some reason in the Merriam text, the redheaded stepchild is synovial membranes, which are, again, going to line your joints and secrete the synovial fluid for your joints, okay? So I'm not sure why they're the redheaded stepchild, but I at least mention them here. So again, our cutaneous membrane, we're not going to talk a whole lot about because please remember that we are going to have a whole chapter on cutaneous membrane coming up here. And, it's going to be a big part of the chapter. I shouldn't say a whole chapter, but a big part of the chapter when we do the integumentary system, okay? So cutaneous membrane, again, is basically our skin, and it's going to cover our body surface. And the cutaneous membrane, as we're going to talk about in that next chapter, is going to consist of your epidermis and your dermis, okay? Does not consist of the subcutaneous layer, which is actually below your skin. So this is going to be dermis and epidermis, okay? Again, makes more sense when we get to the integumentary system. Then our mucous membranes, okay, are going to line body cavities that are open to the exterior, the outside world. So again, things like your respiratory tract, right? Because you're breathing in that air from the outside world. So we like to have mucous membranes line that because, again, we want to be able to trap bacteria and trap dirt and things like that as we breathe in the air from the outside world. Same here with our GI tract, right? So we like mucous membranes to line our GI tract because we're going to be eating food from the outside world, and we really, want to trap the bacteria and things like that. And it also helps, again, to kind of reduce friction as food boluses move down, that kind of stuff. So again, you're going to find mucous membranes lining places like the mouth, again, the GI tract, the stomach, the vagina, and the urethra, okay, are also going to be two things that are going to be exposed, right, to the outside world, so you'll have mucous membranes there. Now, please keep in mind that even though mucous membranes are really good, that mucus is good at trapping things, pathogens can still move across those mucous membranes. And so that's why we, tell you don't rub your nose and that kind of stuff, because your cutaneous membrane, your skin, is a really good barrier. Like bacteria is not, squeezing right through your skin. But you get bacteria and stuff on your hands, right? Throughout the day. And then if you rub your nose, okay, then you introduce that bacteria into your nose where you just have your mucous membranes protecting it. And pathogens can move more easily across that mucous membrane than your cutaneous membrane. So that's why they always say, wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands. Because again, even though that skin provides a barrier, it still, it still can harbor bacteria on top of it, okay? And again, those mucous membranes, you have mucous membranes in your eyes, mucous membranes, your nose and your mouth are, again, provide some protection, but bacteria, pathogens can still get through them. So if you don't want to get sick as flu season approaches us, okay, there are things that you can do to really prevent that. 1, wash your hands. 2, don't rub your eyes. I tell my kids the same thing. I don't want them sick all the time, right? Don't rub your eyes. Try not to touch your eyes, again, because you just have mucous membranes there protecting. Don't rub your nose, and don't rub your mouth. Wash your hands before you eat. Those are all things that you can really do to help protect yourself from getting sick. Okay, that third membrane is your serous membrane. We already talked about serous membrane, so I'm going to talk about these really briefly. Remember, again, this membrane has these squamous cells that are going to line that cavity, whatever it be, like if it's a pericardial cavity, and secrete. So sorry, here's the pericardial cavity, not the pleural cavity, but here's your pericardial cavity, and it's going to secrete the slippery fluid that we call serous fluid. Remember, the goal of that is to really help like kind of create this gelatinous sac around any organ that's having to do a lot of contracting to help reduce friction for that organ, okay? So serous membranes, please remember, are going to line body cavities that are closed to the exterior. So here, your pericardium, right, is going to be this double membrane, and it's going to be closed here. So it's going to line around the heart and be a closed membrane, okay? It's not open to the outside world. Remember that we have our three major types of serous membranes. We have our pericardium lining around the heart, our pleural membranes surrounding each of the lungs, and then we have our peritoneum that's going to surround our abdominal organs, because again, our abdominal organs are constantly contracting, moving food boluses through the GI tract, okay? So just as a reminder, those serous membranes, remember, are going to have a visceral layer and a parietal layer, okay? And so again, the visceral layer is going to be right up against the viscera, the organs, and the parietal layer is going to be farthest from the organ here. And then basically, again, it looks like you can picture like the pericardium. The heart would be your fist if you pushed it into a balloon. And again, the pericardium is the balloon here with that inner visceral layer and the outer parietal layer. So we call that the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium. And then again, it has that serous fluid, okay, secreted between it. And that serous fluid is this kind of thick gelatinous fluid that really acts as the lubricant, okay, as the heart is contracting to help buffer the heart. So it's not like rubbing up against your, rib cage and damaging the heart. That would be bad, right? Okay. So those are your serous membranes. Synovial membrane, which again is like the redheaded stepchild for some reason of this textbook. Synovial membranes, again, are just going to line your joint cavities here, and they're going to be secreting that synovial fluid, okay? So we'll talk more about this, again, when we get to joints, but I just want to mention it here. So again, these synovial membranes are going to secrete the slippery synovial fluid. And of course, just like serous membranes, again, its goal is to kind of, again, act as this gelatinous sac to help prevent friction as the bones at a joint move, right? So that you're not like constantly damaging the end of these bones. We'll talk about in synovial joints too, you even have some articular cartilage at the end of each of those bones, okay? Really briefly, I'm not going to get into this very much because we're going to talk about this when we get into the integumentary system. But again, tissues can repair themselves. So when a body barrier is compromised, the inflammatory and immune responses are going to be activated and take over. Repair is going to start pretty quickly, and repair is kind of the function of the inflammatory processes, believe it or not. If you have an autoimmune disease, then something goes wrong here and there's too much, okay, inflammatory processes going on. But that's the main kind of function of your inflammatory processes. So repair can actually happen in two major ways. We can either have regeneration, which is just the same kind of tissue replaces the destroyed tissue, okay? So your original function is totally restored, okay, in regeneration, okay, which is what we see a lot of. But sometimes we can get fibrosis. And oftentimes in fibrosis, what happens is connective tissue, which usually happens in like a much larger wound. Connective tissue can actually replace some of that destroyed tissue. And we actually lose a little bit of our original function. So, damage, when we see damage to the heart, this can happen. And basically that fibrosis is kind of like scar tissue. And it usually isn't elastic. It doesn't do its function as well. And that's really bad when you're talking about, again, something like heart tissue, okay? I'm not going to talk about this because, again, we're going to talk about this more when we get into repair of skin, because that's mostly epithelial tissue. But just really quickly, there are different regenerative capacities of different tissues. So some tissues regenerate really well. Epithelial tissues, bone, areolar connective tissues, dense, irregular, and then blood-forming tissues. But you can think of epithelial tissues, again, obviously are going to regenerate really quickly. You're constantly scratching and cutting your skin. Also, I have 2 kids with gastric tubes. And so remember that there's epithelial tissue lining, again, the inside of the stomach. And so they have this stoma, and it, again, goes directly into the stomach. Now, the challenge is that if they pull this out at school, it becomes kind of an emergency, because that epithelial tissue inside lining the stomach, it's, again, rapidly regenerating and constantly replacing itself. And so what can happen is that stoma can close up quite quickly. The stoma is the opening there that they create surgically. And so that can close up really quickly, believe it or not. Like within hours, it starts to tighten up. And so, that's, if that helps you to remember how quickly some of our tissues can start to regenerate. Some tissues that have just moderate regenerating capacity are smooth muscle. So that's why, like, if you have abdominal surgery into one of your organs, it takes a little longer to heal. If they had to cut into any of your organs, your actual organs lined with smooth muscle. And then also dense regular connective tissue. So things like that are in your tendons and ligaments. Okay. Those are going to regenerate slower because, remember, they're avascular. Tissues with virtually no functional regenerative capacity are going to be things like cardiac muscle. So again, you don't want to damage your heart muscle. Also nervous tissue of the brain. So take good care of your brain, spinal cord, okay, because those tissues don't like to regenerate. There is some new research that shows cell division does occur, and there are ways to coax them. So that's a lot of the kind of new treatments for people that have had some type of neural injury. They are trying to find ways to coax those cells to regenerate themselves better. And obviously, you can inject stem cells into these areas and things like that. So there is all kinds of new research going into this, which makes it really interesting. Okay, we got through that. If you have any questions, again, always contact me. I am more than happy to help you out.